Hi folks, Carl James here from Electric Media Madness. Another Star Trek Picard video for you today, fresh off having just watched episode 2 entitled Maps and Legends. I'm going to be diving right into spoiler territory, so if you haven't watched the episode yet, spoilers ahead, spoiler alert, please watch the episode if you don't want to be spoiled by this review. So I'm going to begin with a plot synopsis, but I'm going to do things a little differently in this video and intersperse some thoughts and observations as I go along, simply because there's so many things to cover for this episode. The episode begins 14 years in the past on Mars at Utopia Planitia, Starfleet's shipbuilding yard. We see humans and aliens working at the facility, as well as synthetics, artificial life forms, who were mentioned in episode 1. We witness their interaction with biological workers, who seem rather dismissive to varying degrees towards the synthetics. We then witness the synth rebellion / attack on Mars that was alluded to in episode 1. We see a synth killing his workmates and doing something to the computer system that seems to aid the massive attack against the planet. Just before the mass destruction, the synth shoots himself in the head. Next we jump forward to the present day and Jean-Luc Picard's vineyard, where he's talking to his female Romulan friend and housemate Laris about Darsh, the young superhuman female that Picard met in the previous episode. This scene is a little bizarre as it seems to jump constantly back and forth between this conversation at the vineyard and an identical conversation at Darsh's apartment, where the two are investigating what happened to Darsh. Laris concludes that Darsh's attackers were members of the Shat Varsh, an uber-secretive Romulan intelligence outfit more powerful than the Romulan Tal Shiar. Laris reveals that Shat Varsh have an intense hatred towards artificial life forms and any research into the subject, and says that their attitude is based on, as she puts it, hate and fear and pure loathing. She actually goes as far as to say that Romulus has never had any artificial life forms and that nobody's ever studied or attempted to create them in the Romulan Empire, and I'll return to that matter shortly. Next we jump to the Borg cube to Romulan scientist Narek and Darsh's twin, Dr. Soji Asher. The pair are now sleeping together, and we learn the Borg cube is also referred to as the artifact. Narek tells Dr. Asher that he is a very private person, despite the fact that he revealed a load of personal information about himself as soon as he met Dr. Asher in the previous episode. Back in his vineyard, Picard is visited by an old friend who apparently served with Picard as a medical officer aboard Picard's pre-Enterprise command, the Stargazer. This friend tells Picard that he's developed a terminal neurological condition very similar to the one that we see Picard suffering in the final Star Trek The Next Generation episode, All Good Things. In that story, the condition is called Irumodic syndrome, although it's described identically as Irumodic syndrome in this episode. The friend leaves the condition nameless. Next we see Picard arrive at Starfleet headquarters with some reused FX shots from San Francisco from the previous episode I might add, and we are introduced to a female Starfleet Admiral, Clancy. Picard asks Clancy if he can be reinstated in Starfleet, given command of a small ship and crew, and assigned to investigate Darsh and the threat from the Shat Varsh. Admiral Clancy swears and shouts at Picard and ultimately refuses his request. She says that she knows Picard's opinion of Starfleet following the aborted plan to evacuate Romulus. We also learn that this apparently was decided when 14 races threatened to pull out of the Federation if they went ahead with the plan. She says that such a threat to the cohesion of Starfleet forced their hand into making the decision not to help the Romulans. The scene's actually very revealing about the way in which current year political ideology has been so ham-fistedly inserted into contemporary television programmes. Here the dialogue between Picard and Clancy serves a number of purposes. Firstly, it's used to present a superficial argument that's analogous with the current state of Western politics, specifically those favoured by the media in America and the UK. Picard says to Clancy that the Federation doesn't get to decide if a species lives or dies. Clancy replies, "Yes, we do. We absolutely do. Thousands of other species depend on us for unity, for cohesion. We didn't have enough ships left. We had to make choices." When Clancy explains that the choice to keep the Federation intact was more important than saving the lives of Romulans, we're actually getting a veiled backhanded swipe at some of the Trump administration policies, along with things like the UK leaving the European Union. Picard gives Clancy a speech about these types of political decisions, to which she replies, "How dare you lecture me?" She continues, "The pitiable delusions of a once great man, desperate to matter. This is no longer your house, Jean-Luc, so do what you are good at. Go home." This line also gives an undercurrent of identity politics, i.e. the masculine versus the feminine. The writers are using this scene to basically say the patriarchy is out, the matriarchy is now in charge. And you might think this actually quite deep for post-2009 Star Trek, but trust me, it isn't really. Muddling so many messages together, the writers have done themselves a disservice by making women look ruthless and almost malevolent. It's not a message that contemporary Trek writers and producers favour. If anything, they favour belittling men and making them look like the proverbial bad guys. The reason for this cock-up? Hack writing, plain and simple. In their attempt to force so many messages, they've ended up saying very little of importance. The Trek of old could have done this so much better, and far more subtly. After his dressing down and refusal from Admiral Clancy, Picard departs Starfleet headquarters. Back on the Borg cube, we see a number of scientists, including Dr. Asher and Narek, about to enter a Borg-active part of the ship to do their work. At his vineyard, Picard is visited by Dr. Agnes Girardi from the Daystrom Institute. Dr. Girardi is seen looking over a book by sci-fi writer Isaac Asimov. This prompts a somewhat amusing line from Picard, who says, "I never really cared for science fiction, I guess. I just didn't get it." There's probably a view that's shared by Patrick Stewart and most of the writers-producers that work on Star Trek these days. Dr. Girardi has been checking, and it appears that Dahj's identity was created 3 years ago. Picard speculates if this is Dr. Bruce Maddox is doing, but Dr. Girardi claims that she doesn't know. The pair speculate about Dahj's twin sister, where she is and what she's doing. On the Borg ship, the viewer gets some answers to the aforementioned questions. Dr. Asher is watching work being carried out on Borg drones to remove their artificial implants. One of the Romulan scientists calls the drones the Nameless, a term that Dr. Asher apparently hates. A little identity politics here, maybe. The scientist responds, "Nameless is a name." Dr. Asher comforts a drone after removal of a key implant, saying, "You are free now, my friend." At his vineyard, Picard is contemplative following his visit to Starfleet HQ. He takes out his old Starfleet communicator and pins it to his top. It communicates with someone asking for help and a ship. In a section of Starfleet headquarters, we meet Vulcan Commodore O. She's contacted by Admiral Clancy, who voices concerns about the subjects Picard raised during his visit with her and asks that they look into Picard's claims, just in case. Commodore O dismisses Picard's claims and calls him the Hermit of Labar. A little nod here to Luke Skywalker at his retreat to the island of Acto, maybe? Once a chat with Clancy is over, Commodore O summons Lieutenant Rizzo, an undercover operative. We learn that it was the lieutenant's operation that led to the attack on Dahj in the previous episode. Commodore O berates Rizzo, saying that the operation nearly blew their cover. Rizzo is assigned to watch Picard's activities and deal with him if necessary. Rizzo says that she was already put her best man on it. In a desert region, Picard steps out of a shuttle taxi and walks towards a metal cabin where he meets Raffi Musica. Apparently she is the person who's going to help Picard get his ship. On the Borg cube, Lieutenant Rizzo appears via hologram to speak to Narek. They appear to be working together. Narek implies that Rizzo isn't human as she appears to be. Narek is revealed to be part of the Shat Varsh operation. Rizzo refers to Dr. Asher and other synthetic lifeforms as abominations. She then talks down to Narek a bit and calls him a baby brother, revealing that they are siblings, and that Rizzo is presumably Romulan. And the episode ends there. So at this point I want to go through a few notes that I made whilst watching this episode. As I mentioned in my previous Picard review video, this era of Star Trek contains the use of certain types of language and slang that are contemporary to our world today, but never really been in use prior to 2005 in the various incarnations of Star Trek. Like the last episode, we have it here again, such as the Utopia Planitia worker who says, "The dude creeps me out," in reference to a synth worker, the synth who exclaims, "Hell yeah," and the scientist on the Borg cube who describes Narek as hot. I find this kind of thing incredibly jarring. It seems out of place and contradictory to established Star Trek canon. In a similar vein, we have the use of cursing and swearing, something that again is pretty much absent in pre-2005 TV Trek and only occasionally heard in Star Trek films. Contemporary Star Trek now has a semi-regular use of the F-word. Several uses are heard in this episode alone, from Laris calling the Shat Varsh cheeky fuckers to Admiral Clancy berating Picard for, in her words, his sheer fucking hubris. Now, I'm no prude about such things. I can swear with the best of them, and I've never been that much bothered when it's used in television and film. But it feels so unnaturally and totally out of place in a fictional universe like Star Trek, one where humanity has apparently evolved past the use of such terminology. The Shat Varsh organisation is one aspect of this episode that seemed to be an area that I made the most notes on. The organisation is described as being very powerful, having been around for an incredibly long time, despite the fact there's been no prime mention of it in Star Trek canon. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this. Star Trek writers have often retconned the canon of the series to introduce new concepts such as Section 31 in Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode Inquisition. However, on most of these occasions when such things have been done, the writers have meticulously studied the history of the show to make sure that such introductions did not contradict the established canon, and wherever they did, ensure that such contradictions were only very minor. Again, this was the case with the introduction of Section 31. Interestingly, Section 31 is a proverbial storybook when the JJ Brigade continually returned to it in post-2009 Star Trek. First in the Star Trek movie Into Darkness, and then repeatedly in the Star Trek Discovery timeline. However, on these occasions, these writers have used Section 1 in a reckless and carefree manner, showing total disregard for or knowledge of the established canon. This may also be the case with the Shat Varsh when Laris gives her speech to Picard about there never having been any cyberneticists, cybernetic research or artificial life forms in the Romulan Empire. My ears pricked up, no pun intended. I love my past Trek canon, and while some aspects of the lore and memorable dialogue come back to me instantly, I have to dig around in my memory a little bit for others. And I was watching this scene between Laris and Picard, and I remembered a line from Star Trek The Next Generation about a host of Romulan cyberneticists. I couldn't immediately recall who it was that had said it, so I paused the episode for a minute or two. Eventually it came back to me. It's actually from a third season Star Trek The Next Generation episode called The Defector. The Enterprise D rescues a low-ranking Romulan officer who wants to defect in order to prevent planned for war between the Federation and the Romulan Empire. Subsequently, we learn that this man is actually Admiral Jarok, a high-ranking Romulan, and we have this scene in 10 Forward where Jarok is being observed by Lieutenant Commander Data, the android. Apparently Data's trying to figure out what Jarok's true intentions are, and Jarok tells Data that he knows a host of Romulan cyberneticists that would love to be this close to him. If Jarok's words were true then, it completely contradicts everything that Laris reveals about the Shatvash and Romulan attitudes towards artificial beings. But there could be a counter-argument to this, that Jarok wasn't being honest about all aspects of Romulan culture. After all, Starfleet Admiral Hayden tells Picard that Jarok could be considered a less than reliable source of information in the episode. That being said, there are other vague references to Romulan interest in the science of artificiality, such as in the two-part Next Generation story Unification and the fourth season episode Data's Day as well. We also have Shinzon and his Riemann allies reprogramming B4 for their purposes in the film Star Trek Nemesis. Where did they get that knowledge from to do that? A counter-argument here might be that these were Riemanns and not Romulans. However, the hair is being split pretty fine there. What this demonstrates, yet again, is that the writers and producers of contemporary Star Trek have either little knowledge of or little regard for the continuity and canon of the Star Trek universe as a whole. Laziness regarding the established law and rules of past Trek is also apparent in the scene where Picard beams into the area outside Starfleet headquarters. People appear to be beaming in and out of the transporter gateway area like flies, giving no indications of where they want to go to. They just beam away and that's it. There appear to be no computer terminals or operating personnel at these terminals either. And it may be that people pre-booked where they wanted to go before they arrived at these terminals, or they're scanned by the gates to identify them and thus their choice of destination. But there's no dialogue or visual cues to indicate any of this in the episode. We're simply left to assume for ourselves. Lazy writing as far as I'm concerned. As a side point, security at Starfleet headquarters also seems to be really crap. Nobody appears to be watching over these constant beam-ins and outs. Starfleet headquarters is the Star Trek version of the United Nations building or the Pentagon, for example. Try getting into one of these locations without, at the very least, an ID check first. I also want to make an observation about a scene where Picard learns that he has Irumodic syndrome, or we assume it's Irumodic syndrome. And it really felt like this scene might have actually been a planned scene for a visit from Dr. Beverly Crusher, but then rewritten to include Picard's friend from the Stargazer instead. The scene does feel very similar to when Dr. Crusher tells Picard about his impending illness in the final episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, All Good Things, which may be why I had that thought whilst I was watching that scene. It is a very, very similar scene. I don't know if Gates McFadden was approached to reprise her role for a cameo. She's never said anything of that kind in interviews or recent convention appearances or anything like that. She may have been asked and said no, or she said yes, and then somebody else involved in the production of the show poo-pooed the idea. I don't know, I'm just speculating here. There is a further subject here as well about established Next Generation characters on being written out of this show effectively, other than cameos. I thought the inclusion of the line about Picard considering asking Riker, Worf or Geordi to help to be very, very telling. Picard says he doesn't want to put these people through that kind of scenario. Basically, it's a convenient way to eliminate the cast of Star Trek The Next Generation. Like I say, we have got a cameo coming up with Riker and Troy, but it is only a very minor scene. Data obviously is only appearing in some very brief dream sequences and things like that. So these are cameos really. They're not the Next Generation cast coming back in any major way. So you remove that scenario effectively from the series with one simple line of dialogue. On a final note, I just want to correct something from my review of the previous episode of Star Trek Picard. It's not an error, it's just something that I noticed when watching this episode. In the video, I said that there was 19 producers of the show. And I watched this episode and I caught the name of an additional producer in the closing credits, somebody called Robin Johnson. And I looked at the end credits of the previous episode, episode 1, and the name is also listed there as well. So what that means, at least at this point in time, that Star Trek Picard's actually got a total of 20 producers. I previously said 19. You really do have to wonder what all these people are doing, so many of them working on a show like this. Overall, I wasn't as engaged with this episode as I was with episode 1. Maps and Legends, it's far more of a feel of Star Trek Discovery about it, both in terms of story, characterization, pacing, look, that sort of thing. And that isn't a good thing in my opinion. The member berries, which I actually enjoyed in episode 1, they were pretty absent in this episode. I didn't even see the pooch number 1 in this episode unless I blinked and missed him. There's a hell of a lot of female affirmation, man baiting, identity politics, far more apparent here, and a definite distraction from the events of the episode. I still think there's a core of a good story in this series, and maybe it's the one that was allegedly plagiarised from a treatment by Brian Fuller. Who can say about that? I'm also still, at least for now, enjoying watching Jean-Luc Picard on TV again, despite his current form. My overall score for this episode is, it's a 3 out of 10. With that, I just want to say thank you for watching this video. Please like and share this video if you can, and if you enjoy the channel, please consider subscribing. Also, don't forget to click the bell icon for notifications of new content, and I will see you in the next video.